Railroads were, as it has been said, the space program of the 1880s. And the reason that it was so important is that railroads changed everything from politics to economic development to education and even architecture. Railroads really began in New Mexico in 1879 when the New Mexico and Southern Pacific Railroad, a subsidiary of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, crossed over Raton Pass into the territory of New Mexico. And from there they continued toward Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and eventually south to El Paso. Prior to railroad haulage of both passengers and freight, anything that couldn't be carried in a wagon by oxen was usually left behind or it was constructed here. So New Mexico began to look different as a result of the railroad. First came the transcontinental mainline companies, the big ones that were based out of the territory, usually in Chicago or on the California coast. And then came a number of smaller railroads, the branch lines, the individual railroads, logging railroads, coal railroads. Those types of things followed later. This is a contemporary map of the rail system in New Mexico. Between the present time and when the railroad first began entering New Mexico, there were a total of about 122 railroad companies. Some of them existed for a long time, some of them didn't. This map is particularly useful not so much for researchers, but for historians or people that want to get a feel for what New Mexico railroad history is like at a glance. The red lines on the map show lines that are abandoned, and that means there isn't any traffic on those lines anymore, but there used to be. And there are over 2,000 miles of these abandoned lines in New Mexico, all the way to the north, to the central part of the state, and to the south. It's important to recognize when we're talking about railroads in New Mexico that the iron steed, as it was called, came relatively late to New Mexico when compared to the rest of the country. Railroads were developed in the 1840s and the 1850s, and they had been developing in Ohio, in Illinois, and in a number of eastern states. And there were also concerns that a number of the states may have been too generous and too lenient with the requirements for railroad operations. A number of railroads developed in New Mexico that were called paper railroads. They neither owned track nor cars, but they were legitimately organized as railroad companies through the territorial legislature because statutes were extremely forgiving in anticipation of railroad development in the area. Because of those eastern state experiences, New Mexico began to tighten up some of its regulations, and with the onset of statehood, one of the things that remains in the Constitution today is something that's known as the Anti-Donation Clause. A number of western states have that, and what the Anti-Donation Clause does, and this is a direct result of the number of railroads that operated here, is that it prohibits the use of public monies for the construction of rail lines. And interestingly, even though that is not specifically so much of an issue today, that amendment in the Constitution remains. There was an assumption that because Santa Fe had long been a trading area and a place where a number of historic trails met, it was a good place for a railroad to head for in terms of trade, in terms of more commerce. Naturally, what railroads wanted was to carry freight and people, and because Santa Fe had always been known for those two commodities, it was a good place to start.
Train Travel USA, America's best buy in transportation.
In the 1940s and in the 1950s, there was a concerted effort to bring tourism to the railroads, not necessarily to the west, but just passengers that were going anywhere from Chicago to LA, with interesting stops in Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, all kinds of places. And because of that, there was a real interest in developing Indian art and promoting Native American landscape, Native American arts and crafts. And the Santa Fe Railway in particular was very adept at doing that. It hired painters, it hired architects that emphasized the southwestern mode and motif. And the Santa Fe Railway Company did capitalize on that. with cars, and after the Second World War, with a large number of troops coming home, there were more people that wanted to see the country more leisurely. That ended a lot of the passenger train business that had developed in the 30s and the 40s. And as a result of that, some of the passenger trains of that era began to cut back, and did so steadily until the 1970s when Amtrak was initiated. The railroads really meant a lot to the state. It almost depends which snapshot in time you're talking about, because early on, railroads really were a promise of economic development. If an entrepreneur were on the rail line, he was almost, or she, was almost assured of financial success in terms of trade, in terms of economic development. Conversely, if somebody located in a location that they thought was going to be on the rail line and ended up not being on it, they were almost assured of not being successful.